It is wonderful to be here, and on behalf of the center, I just want to welcome all of you to LSE, to give you a very warm welcome. It's hard to think of. I mean, the timing is just incredible. I mean, given that the planning was over a year ago, they began thinking about all this and putting it together. I look forward to 2 days of very stimulating discussion about, the international community's commitment um, to democratic discourse and practices. And I think just coming at a time of incredible churn, both internationally and domestically. I think it's really important that we're meeting, that you're meeting, and this is exactly the kind of thing that the center is interested in supporting as much as it's able to. And I'm really delighted to see it's all coming to fruition, including conversations with LSE Press. That's great. So I looked over the memos last night, and a couple things struck me. One is that there's a lot of contestation here as well, which is good over what the main lines of contestation in the international community are and how thick or thin people think the norms and practices of democratic governance are today in world politics. I think I was just also struck by the fact that we're really discussing, or you're going to be discussing, all of this, and we'll take it up on this first opening panel. It seems to me we're talking about something when against the backdrop of just unbelievable churn inside, arguably the country that has committed so much over a long period of time to create and to nourish the kind of democratic norms and practices that you're all talking about, to be sure, unevenly. But when one listens to Donald Trump's speech yesterday in Saudi Arabia, I mean, it is just quite stunning. I've been around long enough to be able to say I haven't heard anything like that in the United States. And you'd have to probably go back, I think, safely to the 1930s to hear, I think at any rate from a major political figure advancing that kind of perspective. What all this means, I think, is pretty uncertain, and I think only underscores the importance of this meeting. And so we're going to kick it off, I guess, with this first panel. I've been honored with chairing the opening here. So let me just say a few words about each of the speakers before we get started. And we're going to go in the order on the program. So we're going to start with Dalison Belling Lopez, who is a professor of international and comparative politics at the Federal University of Minas Gerais and a research fellow at the National Council of Technological and Scientific Development in Brazil. He's authored or edited many books in peer-reviewed articles on topics related to Latin American politics, to Brazilian foreign policy, and to international institutions. We're then going to turn to Catarina Della Cora, who's an associate professor here in the Department of International Relations. Her latest research focuses on the role of culture and civilization in international relations, with a special reference to Turkey. She has a continuing interest in questions of secularity and secularization in the Middle East, the author of Islam, Liberalism, and Human Rights, Implications for International Relations, and Islamist Terrorism and Democracy in the Middle East. along with numerous chapters and articles in peer-reviewed journals. Then we'll then turn to Zoe Lefko-Friedi, who is University Professor of Politics and Gender, Diversity, and Equality at the Department of Political Science at the University of Salzburg. She researches and teaches on democracy, diversity and equality, focusing on the causes and the consequences of unequal political participation and representation. She coordinates the consortium of the Horizon Europe Project Push Back Lash, and is a member of the consortium of the Project Act EU, where she chairs the working package on representation. And last but not least is Tim Mariti, who is the head of the Peace Building Interventions Program at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation in Cape Town, and is also extraordinary professor, University of Free State and Stellenbosch University, as well as a research associate at the Institute for Democracy, Citizenship, and Public Policy at the University of Cape Town. So we have a star-studded lineup. The panelists were given 3 prompts, 3 great questions. What role do understandings and practices of democracy play in current world politics? Is this role fundamentally different in different parts of the world? So is there regional or cross-national variation? And what are the implications of tensions over democracy for U.S. leadership in the international order? I don't think we're expecting all of the panelists to address all 3 questions. They've only been given 10 minutes for a provocation, for an initial opening comment, and then what we'll do, we'll have enough time after each of them have spoken to really open it up and try to get a full table conversation going here, and see if we can't get some takeaways. So with that, Dallison, we're going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Peter, for your kind introduction. And yeah, I just want to share with you how honored I am to join this truly global choir of voices on democracy and IR. Thank you, Matthias, for the invitation, all the conveners. So I'm happy to be here, honestly. And as I believe it falls within my responsibility to, in a way, to prepare or to set fire to the stage, I'll try to not to disappoint you. I'll give you some food for thought. So I'd say, to begin with, my feeling as somebody who is sitting in the Global South, I'm one of the few participants who is affiliated with a institution of higher education in the Global South. So my impression when I read the memos, which are really fine, it was such a nice experience to read all of them in a row. And but I feel I can dialogue with them in a way that is counterintuitive, because my initial point is maybe the West and the Western academic community is not taking multipolarity seriously enough. That's my impression. And I'm not referring to multipolarity in an adjective way, as in democracy in IR in a multipolar world. So I'm alluding to multipolarity in a more substantive way, as an independent variable, like as a causal variable. Because the impression that I get is multipolarity might be behind all this transformation we are now witnessing, especially referred to the concept of democracy, be it applied internally, domestically, or globally. So this is my first claim this morning. We should take multipolarity more seriously. And why so? Because I would claim that democracy as we know it, as we got used to reference, democracy is a byproduct of the post-war era. Not that it didn't exist before World War II. Of course it did, in a way. We can trace back its roots to ancient Greeks, to the founding fathers of the American Revolution. I mean, one can find how many landmarks he or she pursues. It's easy to find a landmark in order to make the narrative cohesive. But in the way we got used to democracy in its full institutional complexity and normative appeal, we are definitely dealing with a byproduct of the post-war era. Because at the time, in the late 1940s, the Western world would concentrate, and by Western world, I'm referring to, North America plus Western Europe, of course. The Western world would concentrate in its hands some 75% of the world's GDP. So the West was literally in a position to design the nascent world order. They were in a position to do so, and they have done so. But now, and I'll stick to my 10 minutes, I have to be really fast in exposing this. The material foundations of the world are changing. And so is the idea of democracy. The semantic field is undergoing transformation because of the inputs that come from the global south. So again, multipolarity matters as a causal variable. This is not good or bad in itself. Please don't get me wrong. I treasure democracy. I treasure liberal democracy. I come from a democratic society, and we are proud of being a young democracy, Brazil. But still, what I think doesn't matter much. Actually, as I mentioned before, from where I sit, the prospects for liberal democracy don't seem brilliant. It's not the wave of the future. On the other hand, when you look around, you see countries like China, India, which claims to be the largest democracy in the world, or the Persian Gulf countries, Egypt, there are many countries, they're rising to prominence and then exporting their worldviews, their values. They are growing stronger, they're growing wealthier, and now they can influence the world in a way they could not do until recently. But it's not only this. They are given, or they have been given, institutional platforms to project their voices. So think of, I don't know, take the BRICS grouping, take the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, take ASEAN, take the African Union, take the GCC. None of them is premised on democracy, on democratic values, on liberal democracy. No way. But one can arguably claim that all of them, in some ways, they can be more horizontal in nature than the IMF, the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the UN Security Council. It's plausible. One can sustain this kind of line. And this is ironic. Sounds counterintuitive, as I mentioned before. So please allow me, and I have to conclude, to leave you with three propositions. One, there's no global democracy detached from global power dynamics. Multipolarity matters more than we seem ready to admit. This is how I feel. We're not taking it seriously enough. Proposition number 2, any global democratic covenant must take into account local needs and aspirations. There's no defense of the rule of law in a purely abstract fashion. When countries of the global south, which are plagued by poverty, hunger, criminality, war, when they finally rose to some degree of prominence, it became possible for them to stand for their own societies, even if it goes against an idea of global constitutionalism, or global rule of law, of cosmopolitan democracy. So now it's affordable for a country from the global south to go against this set of hegemonic values which stemmed from the West. And proposition number 3, we appear to be headed to a clash of moral worldviews. This is where the normative battleground of current times lies. So there's a conversation on the ontology of democracy, which is really serious. And this mood of contestation over democracy has not only to do with the failure of democracy to deliver economic performance, which is common sense speech in the West, but it has also to do with the procedural and moral failures of democracy itself. Let's take just a few examples from the Americas. It was democracy that took to the presidential office Bukele, Nicolás Maduro, Jair Bolsonaro, and please allow me, Donald Trump. It was democracy in the end of the day. And so being, and I'll leave you with the 3 propositions. I just wanted to add one more line. There's a very interesting work by Barry Buzan and Amitav Acharya from 2007, in which one finds one line which struck me as very meaningful. There is non-Western IR theory. The problem is it is often hidden. We just cannot find it in the most prestigious journals, mainstream academic institutions. So it's time for us to find it, this hidden treasure, because it's going to be very helpful, useful for us to make sense of current times. Thank you very much.
Great. Donaldson, thank you very much. That's a nice set of, first of all, you came in right on time, but a set of very strong claims. Nicely help frame and sharpen the discussion here. Katerina, we're going to turn it over to you.
It's as if we had coordinated, because I'm responding to some of the things that you've just said. We didn't, but so I was asked to address the panel questions and the conference themes from the perspectives that highlight democracy in the Middle East in particular. So let me start by saying that the debate on democracy in the Middle East has subsided once again following the upsurge during the Arab Spring and its follow-up. With the overthrow of authoritarian regimes in Egypt and Tunisia and the challenge to other regimes after 2010-11, there was inevitably a hopeful moment that a democratization wave, similar to what had happened in Eastern Europe, was going to take place in the Middle East. Now, we all know that civil war and authoritarian revanchism have followed, together with the rise in status and prominence of regional powers such as Iran and especially Saudi Arabia, which do not favor democracy. Now, these things go in circles. I'm not as pessimistic as others, perhaps, about the issue. But I would say, for the purposes of my presentation here, that despite this negative development, I suggest we can still think about Middle Eastern politics through the prism of democracy. Democracy is still relevant to understanding the politics of the region, though not in predictable or expected ways. Its interpretation, and this sort of follows on from what you've said, and meaning are deeply contested. Now, I have 10 minutes to say something coherent and interesting that covers both domestic politics and international governance. So I will focus on one of the many fault lines or debates about democracy that runs through the region. It's between the conservative or authoritarian narrative about politics and top-down control of society in general, and Islamic institutions in particular, put forward by Saudi Arabia and its ally, the UAE, on the one hand, and on the other hand, an opposing view by the Muslim Brotherhood, Qatar, and Turkey. As I said, this is just one of the debates or the fault lines in the region. Now, I want to suggest that the latter, meaning Muslim Brotherhood, Qatar, Turkey, are believers in democracy, but democracy interpreted in a majoritarian way, an interpretation that does not take into account the aspect of democratic system, which is about protecting individual and minority freedoms, but concentrates exclusively on the ballot box. Now, needless to say, this is a negation of the democratic principles, and I would suggest, using an old-fashioned term, perhaps even the essence of democracy. But this is the view, to put it bluntly, that the natural choice of the people, if they are given the freedom to choose, would be Islam and an Islamic party that would lead them. It is also the view held by these particular actors that equates democracy not just with the people's choice, but with a justice that would be obvious, simple, and uncontested. So the justice narrative is very, very important alongside and linked to the democratic narrative. So I will give the example here of the AKP government in Turkey, which under the leadership of Recep Tayyip Erdogan has presented itself as a champion of democracy, both domestically and at the international level. And the two, I find, are connected in very interesting ways. Domestically, since the beginning of the AKP movement in the early 2000s, Erdogan has put forward a presumed link between the will of the people in Turkey, as I've said before, who are devout Muslims, and democracy. And he has argued consistently and sort of persistently that an alien and repressive regime in the form of secularist Kemalism had wanted to keep the people and their natural representatives away from power since the beginning of the Republic in 1923. Now, there are many similarities, but also profound differences between the Turkey case and the style of Erdogan and others such as Putin and even Modi, by the way, which I would be very keen to explore in the Q&A. There are fascinating differences as well as similarities. Now, when it comes to the external realm, international institutions and governance, Erdogan uses much the same rationale. He argues that Turkey promotes justice at the international scene, on behalf of all mankind, but also uses a majoritarian justification, which focuses again not on religion as the on religion as the primary identity marker, for the need to reform international institutions and make them both fairer and more functional. So specifically, he points to the need to reform the United Nations, by which he means expand the Security Council to reflect global realities in a more just way. So this is the multipolarity issue you mentioned before. And he's written a book, which I was just in Turkey last month, is a bestseller in the bookshops. I picked it up 2 years ago, but when I went back just now, it's still there. And this is precisely on the issue I've just mentioned. So when it comes to international relations, Erdogan does not just equate justice with democracy, but believes that democracy has a natural, rightful leader, which is Turkey. Just as domestically, he focuses on the great leader, the man who leads society, similarly at the international level. So I can talk more in the Q&A if you wish about other aspects of this leadership position and what it means about the East and West. And as I said before, about similarities and differences with the narratives from Brazil, China, and so on. So what is the conclusion of all this? First, that democracy remains important in the Middle East, even though it may not appear to be so. Of course, we have to look at the realities of repression at the present moment. Those of you who have followed will have seen that in Turkey, what's going on is really the opposite of a democratic process. Yet, we ignore democratic narratives at our peril. We have to investigate what is meant by these narratives in any given instance. And I would suggest that democracy is not going to go away. The term itself has won the day. The issue is what is meant by it in each specific context and case. In the Middle East, there exists a link between democracy and Islam, but it is a very particular, and I would suggest an unexpected link. So it's not about culture and preference, it's a kind of in different ways. At the global level, the rise in status of powers such as Turkey, their ability to throw around their weight, cannot, I would suggest, be understood simply in material terms. We have to look at the legitimizing narratives. We cannot just treat them as hypocritical or rhetorical devices. We have to look specifically at what is meant by them in any given instance. And I think this is why democracy is relevant and interesting in this discussion. Thank you.
Katerina, thank you. You know, I'm thinking that listening to your comments, following on Dowson's, that we've got two different understandings or views of maybe multipolarity. I mean, one, you kind of stressing it as a causal, as a driver, and what I hear more from the Erdogan case is it's almost a, maybe logical is too strong, but an extension of the domestic politics. And so that might be something to kind of tease out in the discussion. Zoe, you're next up. We're going to turn to you. You've got some slides, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you prefer that I stand or
Up to
stay
you.
here, we can try. So yes, thank you. I thought,
Get away. Can you see the slides?
yes,
Just push it. Should. There we go.
yes, but, okay, good. So I brought some fresh data from 2 Horizon projects that I'm involved in, hoping to somehow give some new insights into how citizens understand democracy and its relationship to gender equality, but also how parties speak about these two, and in which context, what frames do they use. So in one of the projects, we are looking at, in the ACT-EU project, it's about activating citizens' trust in times of polarization. So we're interested in political trust in democratic institutions. And in the other project, we are looking at the phenomenon of anti-gender backlash as part of the democratic backsliding. And obviously, the current US president was also one of the sources of worry for us, because he had normalized a very misogynistic discourse. So once the US president speaks like that, everybody can speak like that. And now obviously things are getting worse, but what we are trying to understand through this material is, where is the source of hope and resistance to this illiberal movement or movements, because right now what is going on in the US and in Russia, so you are the IR experts, but for people that work on democracy, seeing these kind of like similarities and alliances is very shocking. So first, I would like to show you, this is from the ACT-EU project. We were looking at differences of between countries in terms of how important it is to live in a democracy, and on the scale of 0 to 10, people that score 10, it's very important for them. And we see variation. Look at Italy, for example, where there's fewer people that think that it's important. So we're working now on, with regression analysis and stuff on examining the association of this variable with the support for different types of policies that promote gender equality, from equal pay, which is the most famous, to sexual harassment, and the last one where you see a little bit less support is concerning the interruption of pregnancy. So there are different measures, and we see that there is an association. So the people that would be less supportive of gender equality policy measures are also less likely to consider it important to live in a democratically governed country. Now, we wanted to, so we have a paper now in the CPR joint sessions where we're looking at the generational shifts, because obviously, the older people have had different experiences. And we know that older people are more skeptical about what is going on because they know they've experienced dictatorships, and they're more worried than younger generations that have taken democracy for granted. And we see that in terms of gender equality, younger generations are more supportive of gender equality, but this is driven actually by younger women, because when we look at the cohorts like the millennials, we see that younger men are actually stagnated or moving in a different direction. So if there is a relationship between gender equality and democracy, then these kind of data show us that we must be focusing on men, young men. However, this is not only, there's more to this story. That's about social media. We also saw that gender-related statements are actually also associated with high political distrust. So again, we see in a very different context that there is something going on there. So we have conducted focus groups in Austria, which I think is a good case. It played an active role in the Second World War, and it really tried to democratize itself, also with US support. So what we asked there, we're trying to figure out how people think of democracy and whether there is an association with gender equality. So first there's a silent brainstorming, and then there's the discussion. So when we ask them to connect democracy to like what is coming to into your mind, then what we see is that they focus more on procedural aspects, and popular rule, and electoral system, elections, voting rights, and freedom of speech and expression. But in the discussion, they also mention human rights and equal treatment for all. So there is an association, and they think that it's fundamental for democracy. However, when we ask them to specify, they cannot. And data that I will not show now shows that when they speak about gender equality, they think mainly of the economic dimensions like gender pay gap and pension gap and so on. So what is very important in this context, especially after Katerina's contribution, is this othering. So we see that Austrian people that participated in these focus groups, that they think that Austria is very progressive in comparison to the others, especially refugees and migrants that are coming to Austria. And this othering is actually connected gender equality and lack of democratic practices. So we are great. There's a hierarchy in their minds. And this, so there's a racialization of gender-based violence, and inequality is imported. Everything was great in Austria and in Europe. And actually it is this migrants. So women migrating to Austria from Ukraine and Russia are seen as a threat to gender equality in Austria. I thought for this kind of conversation that it would be interesting to look at whether they know about the Istanbul Convention. And actually we see that there's very little knowledge. And this lack of knowledge also impacts how they perceive, for example, Orban's stance. So they're not really worried because first they don't understand, then they also think it's very distant. So I think that in people's minds, the connections are there, very loose, and there's no, concrete. So it's a good basis, but there's a lot of work to be done to make the connections with international treaties and multilateralism and so on. Now, I thought because we're in the UK, maybe you're interested also in seeing what is happening, like you spoke about the one-party rule. I also have a slide on that. Where we see it's actually very positive. Most of the people in the UK, both women and men, they would disagree with a statement that this country would be better off if there were only one party. But let me show you this one, which is about the universal right to vote. So there is people here. So this is the neither nor category, but this is the people that agree that, you should question this universal suffrage if people are not informed enough to, to do it properly. So there is like over 20%.
Your political philosophers.
I will stop with the UK because I want to show you also the party manifestos, because what we saw in the Austrian case, which is a very important case because it is a case that is very successful. The FPÖ is one of the most successful radical right populist parties in Europe. And in the case of Austria and in France, the traditional gender gap in voting for the far right has now closed. So women are not less likely to support this kind of parties that were actually called Männerparteien in the past because they had a lot more men as members. Also, the leadership was very masculine. But now we have had in Austria, Marlene Swarzek, very successful in my own region in Salzburg, and also Marine Le Pen, as you know. And what is going on now in this party's discourse, we see that the last 12 years, they have been increasingly speaking about gender issues. And it is important to note that gender issues in general are not very salient. It's only liberal parties and sometimes the Greens that are actually making them a bit more salient, but otherwise they're like ignored, except for the far-right parties who are trying to own these issues and frame them and put them in their very successful anti-immigrant frame. So this is just the kind of like associations of words that come. There is immigration, very important, heteronormative model, but also they're speaking about equal pay. So they're now trying to appear as the champions of women's rights. And there is, there's a new kind of contestation of gender equality where the far right is trying actually to get that space. They have done it with the welfare state in contesting, like against the social democrats. I've written in the past a piece called about the left authoritarians, because there is people that have actually left-wing economic positions, but right-wing sociocultural positions. So this is exactly the blend that they're using again. And in Austria, we now have this coming ever stronger in the last elections. These are the European party groups where you don't see actually a lot of gender equality. So a lot of parties are silent about it. They used to be silent about immigration as well. And in Austria now we see exactly, what we saw in the people's minds, that there is some kind of connection between immigration and gender equality. Now is a more overt opposition to transgender rights. So they're becoming a little bit more vociferous about gender issues, and they are owning more and more this agenda. Yes. So here we see a mirroring of what the parties are saying and what the focus group participants are saying. So Muslim women, so gender equality, gender inequality is imported. And that's why we should, be careful about accepting, especially Muslim immigrants, because they are the ones who are going to deteriorate our liberal rights and undermine them. So I think it's important to keep that connection because in Europe, which remains the liberal world when the US is turning illiberal, we need to know also what is going on and how parties have maybe failed to contest this issue, and they let gender equality become instrumentalized in an anti-Muslim, anti-xenophobic discourse. So I don't know how much time I have. I think exactly. So I have a lot of slides that I brought for the discussion, but I think that this is to remember that there is a relationship between this anti-gender backlash and democratic backsliding, and that in Europe, we also need to be aware of where the sources of illiberalism are. Thank you.
Thank you, Zoe. I'm hoping we can pick up this thread on the role of othering and threats, because you've provided evidence to suggest that othering leads to, in a sense, fragmentation and the strengthening of, in this case, the far right. It seems to me there's evidence that also suggests that external threats, let's say Russian revanchism or American abandonment, or the threat of the potential of it, is actually strengthening the center in Western democracies. Whether one points to Canada or to Australia. And so maybe what we need there needs to be some discussion about types of threats and the relationship between threat and democracy. Tim,
Yes,
the floor is yours.
Thank you, Peter, and also your center for convening this very important event. Thanks to Matthias, Rohan, Luca, and Teresa for the kind invitation. Very happy to be on this very distinguished panel. Thank you to Davidson, Katerina, and Zoe for their very important inputs. I will be approaching the topic from a slightly different angle. The title of my paper is Globalizing Democracy Through the Domestic Analogy, Insights from South Africa. And I'm very glad that Daniele screamed out very loudly that those must be political philosophers, because I think this is the time also for political philosophers to enter the fray, to enter the debates. I think Peter said it. We are in a very incredible, a moment of incredible churn. Some say global inflection point. I also want to put onto the agenda item whether we are at a globally constitutive moment as well, despite all the churn. And the reason why the political philosophers become important, Daniele, is because I think the post-Cold War, the post-World War II order is precipitously coming to an end. The international system of collective security, as we know it, has essentially imploded, embodied in the United Nations Security Council. I think it was Antonio Gramsci who, advised us that the crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born, and in the interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. So I think whether we like it or not, we are now very much within this Gramscian interregnum, and you will agree that we have a great variety of morbid symptoms appearing left, right, and center. World disorder reigns. In this vacuum, new struggles to be born. So I want to just very touch upon South Africa's, example of democratic transition to say whether we can, in fact, begin to conceptualize the emergence of a global demos for this constitutive moment, whether we can learn from the South African experience with the difficult process of democratic transition to begin to map out what the contours of a globalizing process, a global constitutive moment, a global constitution-making program might look like going forward, because ultimately, world order is not maintained by power. If anything, those who have been projecting power across the world have demonstrated that, in fact, it leads us to the chaotic situation that we are right now, and I very much echo Davidson's point that the multipolar reality is with us. World order ultimately has to be sustained by efforts to ensure that those who are governed by consent. And picking on Zoe's point, democratic backsliding, democratic reversals, I would argue at the national level, and we can contest this, partly due to the absence of a global democratic order. So that's the approach that I'm taking. The South African political elites, policymakers argue for a much more equitable democratic order. African Union has made a similar point. So that is the frame that I'm using to engage with this debate. I think Davidson also mentioned the importance of us to interrogate the origins of democracy to see whether it resonates with different parts of the world. I would argue straight out that I think democracy is very much a deep institution of the human psyche, not even the international system, but the human psyche. Given its almost universal reference and the instrumentalization of the concept. It is a hurrah word. Everybody is a Democrat. It's an umbrella concept. It has been sanctified universally. Everybody worships this idea of democracy. We have the late General Pinochet of Chile, who described his system of government as an authoritarian democracy. In Africa, we have the King of Swaziland, also known as Eswatini, who lauds his system of government as a monarchical democracy. So even the dissembling that is happening now in the United States through Doge is being justified on the basis of restoring power from unelected bureaucrats back to the people. Go figure, I think it's an Americanism. So this definitions of democracy abound. From where I sit in South Africa, democracy has to be informed by the principle of being a system of government that is by, of, and for the people, but with one additional factor, which is it has to be qualified by a condition of freedom. In the absence of freedom, I think what we have is this myriad forms or claims to democracy. So I think in this perilous phase where we find ourselves, for me, the question is whether we can, in fact, begin to summon an emergent global demos. The South African court case at the ICJ, is that an example of world citizenship? Because there was no other impulse, right? World citizenship goes 2,500 years back in time to the Greeks, the Greek city-states, polites, citizens of the state, who were challenged by the cosmopolites, who considered themselves citizens of the cosmos or world citizens, citizens of the universe. So this is the question, I think, before us now. We keep claiming we would like to see a system emerge. Can we activate that global system and enable world citizens to, in fact, begin to exercise their rights within a global demos? We can have debates about knowledge and its purposes, but I think it's important to summon, to begin to conceptualize this, hence Daniele's point, whether this global demos is in fact emerging. Can we see signs of this in, for example, digital connectivity, the global conversations that are happening, social media, online platforms, citizen journalism, transnational social movements, international advocacy and accountability, supranational governance in the form of the European Union, citizen participation, and the protests that we've seen worldwide, which are pushing not only against conflicts, Gaza, Ukraine. Going to 2003, we had the Iraq protests as well, but also the current challenges facing us in terms of climate change, refugee crisis, regulating AI, and so on. So the point I do make in my paper is that we are in a globally constitutive moment, very much so. The post-World War II order is rapidly disappearing. The rule makers of yesterday have become the rule breakers of today. And the colonial inheritance of this international system of laws are emerging as champions of upholding this law. This is South Africa's case, and the ICJ remains case in point. We can contest that. They are obviously beset by their own internal contradictions. But we're at that point now. I think we need to find ways to bring to the fore and take one step forward to creating, transforming or channeling the energy of this global demos into a system of global democracy, which means a tremendous amount of work will need to be done in global constitution making. It's not the first time that we've been in a globally constitutive moment, just to name a few: the Peace of Westphalia, 1648, the American-French Revolutions, end of World War II, decolonization, the rise of the new nations, fall of the Berlin Wall. And I'm moving quickly because I know Peter's got his eye on the time. Internet, digital connectivity, COVID-19 pandemic, and now we are at the end of the World War II order. And so this constitutive moment gives us an opportunity. The South African process of democratization was extremely arduous, painstaking, exceptionally difficult. But if we take the domestic analogy from South Africa and apply that to the global stage or realm, we'll see it will be equally challenging for us to get to that point where we, at the global level, establish new institutions to manage the rule of law, protect individual rights, establish social contracts, address conflicts, so on and so forth. But it is not an impossible task. And in fact, some of Matthias's work that I've drawn on, his work on global democracy and domestic analogies, identifies several pathways. One is the intergovernmental path, where governments driven to reform, strengthening the UN system, would generate the need for deeper democratic legitimacy, and could lead to the establishment of a global parliamentary assembly. And this is essentially the path that the EU took. And then he also identifies the social movement path, where global networks, activist civil society organization create non-state democratic institutions and campaign successfully to democratize the global system and begin to map out the elements of a global constitution. In this regard, global citizen assemblies become a very important function in this regard. So to begin to conclude, The South African analogy, I think, is crucial. Nelson Mandela's important role in negotiating, even behind the scenes, before we managed to get to an agreement between the different conflicting sides. The Convention for Democratic South Africa, CODESA, was a very crucial structure. The new constitution, and then subsequently the 30-year struggle that South Africa has been in to consolidate democracy, really shows that there will be challenges to globalizing democracy. Sovereignty is one, authoritarian resistance is another, disinformation, political manipulation, so on and so forth. We can unpack those further. But the pathway, final sentence, is also available to us. And in fact, there has been some work that has begun being done in this regard. The founders of the United Nations recognized that the world body would not be able to survive indefinitely in its original form. Article 109 of the United Nations Charter creates, or at least stipulates, the need for a general conference to review the United Nations Charter, which could be an entry point to start this conversation in terms of how we can reconfigure the global system, supranational council, world parliament, global court of justice, taxation of international financial flows. And the last point is that a number of countries have in fact already made pronouncements on this issue. The President Lula of Brazil at the UN General Assembly, September 2024, called very directly for UN Charter reform process. The India-Brazil-South Africa Forum, which is less known than BRICS, but is very much alive, issued a statement, which is a document we can actually reference now. Paragraph 11, I'll read it to you in my last sentence. The magnitude of the collective challenge we face today demands an equally ambitious response. We encourage a wide-ranging reform of the United Nations Charter and the convening of a general conference to review the United Nations Charter in accordance with Article 109. We cannot wait for another global tragedy like the Second World War to build a new global democratic governance on its ruins. Thank you.
Tim, thank you very much. That was a great way to, it seems to me, round out the opening comments here. I saw you definitely draw as well, drew on your very important foreign affairs piece, which is great. I think we're just open the floor here. The way to signal that you want to make a comment is to just put your name up like this. I'll keep a list as we go around and try to get everybody in to the discussion. Somebody want to defend political philosophers? I'm very sympathetic. I have a young son who's just becoming a political philosopher. So, yeah.
Very, very short comment just
Yeah.
to qualify why I interrupted Zoe, because I found your evidence very, very interesting. Can I get back the slide that you presented? Sorry, just to get back the slides. Okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Is it working? Yes. Can we get back the slide that I mean, I'm sorry, I didn't, I interrupted you.
Locked.
There is this slide in which basically you present evidence on the public, which says, should people before the elections be better informed?
Yes.
You know?
Yeah, that's the.
And that is crucial. It's
UK
crucial
data.
because you can read it in different ways, you know? And that's the reason why political philosophers are important. Why? Because political philosophers are challenging the idea that all voters should count one. And they can be in two different directions. One direction is to say that only some people should be allowed to vote. This, for example, was quite typical in many democracies when only literate people were allowed to vote, or even wealthy people were allowed to vote. Or on the other way around, because you want more democracy, and therefore you want the people to be better informed. For example, if we think about the current debate on deliberative democracy, is based on the idea that decisions should be taken when groups of people get better information on the choices in which they are taken. Now, my question to Zoe is very simple. Will your data be able to address the part of the population which says that we need more information to get better democracy from the people which says we would like to exclude some people from the decision making?
So thank you very much for this, because it's important also, you know, like what kind of democracy and who should be part of it. That's the question. I think that there are two problems in this approach. One is that we know that there are gender differences, and not only gender differences, also other marginalized, formerly excluded groups have less confidence. So how are we going to assess who is better informed? Like all this research on political knowledge shows that women, when they are unsure about the answer, they would, you know, they would check, I don't know, whereas men would just gamble and they would get an answer and maybe it's right. So they are systematically, they have more knowledge, although they don't, but based on this data. And the same holds with other marginalized groups. So that's one point that I would like to throw on the table. And the second is, what is going on now in the US is that we have control of information. So Trump has been very smart in making the right alliances, and the people are informed through social media. If you can control the algorithms and how they're fed. So the information they're getting is actually manipulated, or they're fed what they have to be fed in order to make the right choice. So it's typical propaganda. So it's like something we know from authoritarian regimes of the past. It's just that this, in the digital era, this information, importance of information has a completely different effect. And so for me, you know, this, I saw this slide, I showed this slide, but actually I'm myself, I'm very puzzled by, yes, who will judge how, who is informed and who is misinformed, and based on what kind of information, and who is feeding us this information. So I answered with a question.
We have, I think, 3 cards up, now 4. I can't, so I'm going to ask everybody to introduce themselves, especially since this is being recorded, and I can't read every one of them, but it looks to me like, is it Klaus? I think yours went up first, and I think the next one is Tobias from here. I can't read the last one. Why don't we go in that order, and then we'll come back to Hans up here, okay? Go ahead. Maybe we'll take a couple questions. We'll do this in a couple passes and let the panelists respond.
Yeah, Klaus Dingwert from the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. Thanks to the panelists for opening this discussion here. And I think several of you spoke about democracy being redefined, democracy being defined in very different ways, so that we need to look closely at the democratic narratives. And also several, I think, hinted at, Tim, in the end, you said it's a hooray word, it's worshipped, but often emptied of meaning. So the whole, it seems it's semantically a very large space, democracy. And I was wondering where you see the constraining effects of that space, or how is it constrained? What constraints do you incur when you speak democracy? Because you can say I'm an authoritarian democracy, but you will get a response as well. So you're in a spot also when you say illiberal democracy, it's a claim that you're making, and you have to see how it survives in a discourse, right? So I wonder, does democracy have a constraining effect in discourse? And if so, where do you see it?
Thanks for a very interesting kickoff. I've got kind of 2 questions, one for Katerina and one for Tim. I think, Katerina, I'm very interested in the Turkish case as well, and you talked about the connection between democracy and Islam in Erdogan's, should we say, philosophy or theory of governance. Can you say a little bit more about, say, the philosophical roots of that connection? Does he rely on thinkers or traditions of thinking that make that connection? Or is that mainly based on Islam itself and the Quran, or is there a different strand of thinking about this? I mean, in the West, the discussion often is about the two being antidotes. And so the connection strikes me as interesting. For Tim, what can we learn from the South African case? I guess I want to get your opinion on, or no, I think of South Africa as being very unique in many ways. Peaceful transition against all odds, the kind of colonial condition being as much rooted internally in South Africa as kind of an external type of thing as we often think of it. And I wonder how much there is to learn from kind of a unique, in many ways, unique experience of democracy for the wider world. And I've been thinking about that question, for one, in the context of regional integration. How much can we learn about regional integration by looking at the EU, right? Also a very unique case in many ways. Is there much worth in trying to generalize from kind of unique instances? And, you know, yours is in a very different context, but I want to hear your thoughts on that.
Why don't I let you respond to these? And I really open it up to anybody that, in addition to Tim and Katerina, if you have responses to this question, Zoe or John, would be fine. Tim, do you want to start off maybe?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much, Peter. I think the last question by Tobias might be a place for me to start. Still thinking about Klaus's constraining effect, so maybe Klaus, you will help us as well. In terms of what there is to learn, despite appearances, South Africa's transition was not that unique, actually. It echoes a lot of the experiences of a number of countries across the African continent, maybe in the global south. I would even say maybe India. One could find interesting parallels. It was an arduous struggle. It took much longer than most countries for obvious reasons. We had an internal colonialism, essentially, with the white minority. But it was highly contested, very fraught, very complex. The elements of mobilizing the civic sector, the societal actors, to agitate for change, both within South Africa and outside of South Africa, I think gives us very interesting lessons learned, hence parallels that we could use in what is now, I think, our struggle to democratize the world, to promote global democracy, to undertake global constitution making. So my response is there is a lot that we can learn. And I did mention the key turning points in terms of the secret negotiations Mandela did with the apartheid Afrikaner government to get to the point where they could at least have the basic common basis to start a conversation that would lead to the unbanning of the ANC, to the Convention for the Democracy, and to the Constitution. So the analogy for me, I think, is clear in my mind. Maybe you would like to come back on it, is we will need a process where we can have a global conversation. And in fact, this is the function of Article 109 of the United Nations Charter, which is not on the radar, regrettably, of a lot of our policymakers. But the good news is it's beginning to enter enter the radar, if you will. And then that conversation is not going to happen overnight. It's 2-3 years, maybe even 5 years, because we're trying to reconfigure how we can govern the planet. And it'll be fraught. There will be spoilers. I don't think Washington, Beijing, and Moscow for sure will not be in that conversation. Guaranteed. And I don't think we should wait for them to join the conversation. Brussels potentially could be convinced to enter the conversation because, as your own work on regional integration is demonstrating, there is something we should learn from the EU in terms of its multiple level system of governance, which I think then we can juxtapose onto the planetary stage. So the short answer is yes, there is quite a bit that we can learn. The global constitution will not be with us, regrettably, next week. It will take some time, hence the need for our political philosophers. I think to Klaus very quickly, does the word democracy have a constraining effect? I suppose if it means different things to everybody, then it means nothing at all, which potentially then could silence us and we could end up not having a conversation and we could just all go home. But Churchill said it best when he said democracy was the worst form of government except all the others that have been attempted. So I think to your question, perhaps it can have a constraining effect in terms of, are we saying the same thing? Pyongyang claims to be democracy and, it's very different in Switzerland, I'm sure. So that would be for me, perhaps where things get slightly murky, but I don't think it should prevent us from forging ahead. I did say one very important condition from the South African experience is that it is the rule by, of, and for the people in a condition of freedom. So I guess now freedom is another word we have to decide how do we interpret what freedom is. So that I think that would be my response to you. Thank you.
So I'll start with Tobias because it follows on logically. You asked about the sources, the basis of this. To me, this is classic majoritarianism. It's very similar, I think, to what is happening, from what I understand, in India, in the case of Modi. So Islam is important as an identity marker rather than the source of the institutions themselves. What I was trying to say in the presentation is that there's a spirit of the people which is linked very closely to religion, to Islam, which needs to be represented in this way. So you would find this narrative very different to, for example, the Iranian Islamist narrative or the even the Saudi narrative, which rely on Islam a little bit more directly, or at least attempt to. And the sources for Erdogan's philosophy are a mix of traditional Islamic thinkers who tend to agree with that majoritarian perspective, but also individuals who are a mix of nationalists and Islamists. So it's a very interesting case, but also one that can be replicated in other parts of the world. That's why I said in the presentation that Islam is relevant, but not in the expected way that here it is based in the Quran and so on and so forth. And the question of whether democracy is a constraining structure. Yes, yes and no. In a way, if we interpret it in this majoritarian way, it is the opposite to what I suggested democracy really means. This is, of course, a very old problem. It's not a new, it's a new problem. But I think that in the case of Turkey, and that's why I said in the presentation, we have to look specifically in each case, there is a constraining factor. I had a very interesting conversation when I was there last time, last week or last month, whatever it was, with a colleague who was saying that people in Turkey are very attached to the electoral process. This has been something that goes back 100 years. And you cannot simply abolish it like that. So the constraining structure here is the specific national context. not just the logical thing, okay, you're relying on the majority. Of course, you need to find out what the majority thinks. You can get around that by saying, we know what the majority thinks. Everybody knows. So, yeah, yes and no, is my answer. Thank you.
Great. Allison?
Sure, just quickly addressing the question posed by Klaus. I think from a semantic viewpoint, democracy has always been a moving target. So one cannot uphold democratic values based on the Athenian experience these days, right? Otherwise would run the risk of excluding from the political body women, foreigners, not to mention enslaved people. Only basically slave owners would be participating in the political life. Even in the early modernity, I mean, take France, being a democrat in the 18th century had a totally different meaning than, for instance, being a Republican or someone who would defend, embrace the Republican values. So it's always complicated to like find the contours, define the semantic field of democracy. What I am defending this morning is the need, based on the fact of the multipolarization, we need to try to include something that has been excluded so far. I'm referring to some cultural as well as religious, ethnic factors, aspects that have been neglected, because otherwise this detachment between the term democracy and the meanings attributed to democracy across the planet, it's going to grow wider and wider, this gap between the word and the respective practices. So that's my point, basically.
Zoe?
Yes, thank you. So I found this very interesting with the authoritarian democracy. I mean, we know also the term liberal democracy from Farid Zakaria. In the comparative politics literature, we call it electoral autocracy, by the way, the corresponding regime. But then I'm wondering, like, okay, so what is the very basic? You spoke about ancient Athens. I think that when democracy came to this world, it was a very, very different regime from all the previous ones: monarchy, oligarchy, plutocracy, aristocracy. So what was the different thing? It was actually empowering the many. Yes, women and foreigners were excluded. The latter still are excluded in most of the countries. But it was about this empowerment of the many, that it was giving a lot of people a voice. And I think the most important thing was it was granting political equality to economically unequals. So it was the first time that the poor had a voice, the poor men and Athenian men and free men. So I think that was the different thing of democracy. And it was not out of the blue. It was trying to solve a huge social conflict and to avoid struggles and death and bloodshed. So it was, in a way, an institutional solution to social conflict. But of course, as you said, it has changed a lot since then, and in a positive way as well. And we have representation, which is a very different concept. But I think that what we have been talking about, and the US has championed a liberal democracy. So it was not just about democracy in elections and poor people having a say. It was also about freedoms and different kinds of freedoms, freedom of speech and association and human rights, but also this peaceful alternation of power, that you would not object. You lose and you accept that you will lose this time, you will win the next. So it was normal. And that's what we saw first time with Trump, with this, impossibility, like they could not accept that they lost. And that was the first sign that we're going to have what we're having now. Mm-hmm. So I think it's about the liberal part that we should be focusing on, because it could be, elections, but not really a liberal regime. And my 2 cents on the European Union, which I have studied very much, and representation in the European Union, I suggest that if we use the European Union as an example, then we should also look at the failures, because by focusing on the economic dimension, we have failed in integrating politically. And this is a problem that we have now. Who is defending the EU in the EU? The center-right Christian democratic forces actually were the pioneers in pushing for it. And now they are puzzled. They are not defending it. The far right is attacking it. They don't know which direction to go because actually it's their creature. The Social Democrats were against it and the communists too. So because we have not really integrated, the organizations, the political parties. We spoke many years ago about transnational party system in the EU. There is potential, but it has not happened. And there is a reason for it, because the structure does not allow it to become really transnational, that we do transnational voting. So we have a lot of lessons to teach, mainly by our failures. So maybe the African Union can do differently. Yes.
So I'm mindful where we are on time, and we have a lot of cards up, and I have them, I think, in the correct order. So I have Andres first, then Hans, then Barry, then Rohan, then Carmen, then Alexander, and then Matthias.
And then there's no time.
And where, is there another one? Teresa, I didn't see Teresa's card. All right. Well, and yes, so we'll come back. But so let's go ahead and start. Well, what I think we're going to do is we're going to take a series. No, I think what would be good is to get everybody's question on the table, and then they'll all get a bite at the apple at the end and decide what they want to respond to. But that way you get all these comments and issues out here on the table. So let's start right there.
Yes, thank you very much for those wonderful interventions. My name is Andreas Bummel. I'm with Democracy Without Borders. And I would want to caution us, from my perception and perspective, to not potentially buy into an authoritarian capture of the idea of and concept of democracy. Democracy and, the concept has been misused in many ways by many parties in the past, the United States including, but this should not distract us from the fact that, as far as I am concerned, democracy has long passed, being a Western-led and Western pioneered concept. I mean, let's recall, just as an example, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that's been adopted at a time when decolonization made the Global South, as we call it today, a majority in the UN. And many principles that democracy builds on is right there. And it's now being ratified, this particular instrument, to stick to that example, it's been ratified by over 170 countries. So this is not Western-led, right? And the Organization of American States, ASEAN, the South Asian Association of Regional Cooperation, the African Union, et cetera, they all have democracy either in their founding charter or in extra instruments. So I think we should be very aware of that. And democracy, based on all of these instruments, it's pretty clear. And I'm also, a bit surprised, because I believe academically and scientifically, democracy is a very robust and solid concept that can actually be measured, right? It's based on 4 elements: representation, participation, freedom and liberties, and the rule of law, based on a centuries-old constitutional process in different countries. And so I think that's really a danger, that we are drifting into the field where exactly authoritarians want us to be. Mm-hmm. So we have to be cautious. Who are we listening to, right? So it's one matter to listen to Xi, Putin, and Erdogan, what they think about what democracy is. But we could just as well listen to the dissidents and the people in exile from these countries who have quite different views, right? So there are, again, counter-narratives to the authoritarian capture of democracy. And just to provide one more example, International IDEA has made an analysis of speeches at the UN General Assembly. and have come to the conclusion in recent times and have come to the conclusion it's actually countries from the global south who, are those who mostly refer to democracy in those speeches, not the West. Yeah, no, that's just interesting to take note of. And just one more remark, and then I'm finished. Sorry, I know we have so many speakers on the list. It's just such a, difficult to not comment. Since the 90s already, we have this concept of Dahl provided that of democratic transformations in history, starting with the city-states, very imperfect, and then the expansion of democracy to the territorial state and the connection with the French and American revolutions. And now that was the point, the third democratic transformation where democracy is expanding to the global scale for various reasons, but is also deepening, right, into those elements I mentioned. And I would want to make the point, and that is perhaps also a question, I believe that the success of the second transformation, which means democratization of nation states, and the success of global democratization, meaning expanding it to the global scale, it is really interconnected. They cannot succeed without the other.
Mm.
Or in other words, as long as we have dictatorships, totalitarian regimes at the nation state level, there will be no global democratization. That's not possible. So we have to see the interconnection in this interregnum in which we probably are. We have to see the interconnection. And yeah, that's all. Thank you. Maybe you have comments on that.
Great. Hans, you're next.
Can I start
What-
speaking before the mic?
No, you got to wait for the mic. Otherwise you won't be on the recording.
Fine. Hans Sagnier from the periphery in the global north to Davison. Excellent intervention from everyone here. I liked it a lot. And I agree with all your 3 points, the ones you ended with, but I would like to hear more about the first point that you made about multipolarization. And I agree that, yeah, it deserves attention. But as a concept, it seems to locate us into thinking about the distribution of power between states. So that we go from perhaps one power state has more to another one. And is that the bottom line of what you think drives the changes? Or do we need to go somewhat beyond the state system, looking at distribution of power between social groups, between individuals, between anything else? Or are we still within the theory which makes sense when we speak about multipolarization, understanding this great change? Yeah.
Over to Barry. Barry, just raise your hand so since we can see. Yeah.
Thank you. I want to agree very strongly with what Dowison and Tim said about us being collectively pretty much at the end of the Western world order. Whether it's actually come to an end or it's about to come to an end, we can haggle over, but and that we're in a transition to something else, which I've been calling deep pluralism. And that deep pluralism now seems to be taking on a decidedly far-right twist, given that the majority of the great powers are now governed in a far-right way. I think there's one good bet that you can take about all of this, which is that there are decades of controversy ahead about how to reform intergovernmental organizations. Right? Now, possibly this could be collaborative, as Tim suggested. A new conference, something like that. It seems to me a much better bet that it's going to be competitive and that we're already beginning to see the beginnings of that with the BRICS and the AIIB and a variety of other global South-led intergovernmental organizations that are basically saying, well, if you won't reform the ones we've got, then we're going to race with you, compete with you, and set up other organizations. So it seems to there'll be a long process, but I think that's a good bet. I suspect that however this works out, there will be a very similar formula of a combination of sovereign equality and privileges for the great powers, whoever it is they may be at the time, when these remade intergovernmental organizations come out. Because there doesn't seem to me at this point to be any alternative of that. The big debate will be about the redistribution of status and benefits, and most controversially, responsibilities within those intergovernmental organizations. but it seems to me almost guaranteed that that's what we're going to get in the coming decade.
I'm gonna jump the queue here. I know I'm not supposed to do that in the UK, but we're gonna go straight to Carmen. And then to Alexander, and then I think it's Hassan down there. And then if we have time left for our organizers, we will come to our organizers.
I'm gonna use my 10 minutes when I have 10 minutes and to prove what I have to say now, so I'm not gonna.
Go.
Thank you so much for this panel, for kicking up such a fascinating conversation. I'm Carmen Pavel from King's College London, and I just wanted to ask well, everyone, but especially Tim and Dawson, because you've mentioned this being a moment of maybe transformative constitutionalism or opening up opportunities for the changing the constitutive rules of the international order. I just wanted to ask you, what do you think are the preconditions for such a transformation to be successful, however you want to define that? Thank you.
Great. Then we will go straight to Hassan.
Thanks so much, Hassan Damluji. I lead a think tank called Global Nation. I wanted to make a small point that we've been talking about how there are different conceptions of democracy, and there was a point about in Turkey whether that actually has to do with Islam and whether that's based on the Quran or some other interpretation of Islam, or really it's actually not to do with that. And in that context, I thought it was very interesting that there were a couple of comments about ancient Athens, because I think for me, this is another one of those narratives that somehow democracy, as we, and Andreas gave a good definition, has something to do with actually ancient Athens. I don't think it has anything to do with ancient Athens. It's true that in a very Hellenizing period of the English language and the French language, this word that had been used by the ancient Athenians was taken as the word we use to describe these systems. But I think genealogically, they're everything to do with Northern European Germanic systems of choosing the chief, and then the barons, right? And then some kind of parliament, right? And really it's a process of, in the tribes, and as that develops, choosing the chiefs who will represent us and do government in a monarchical system, which in some cases removed the monarchy, in other cases didn't, right? So we're in a less Hellenizing culture than there were 200 years ago, but we're still in a very Hellenizing culture in Europe. And I think it's a red herring to even be talking about what was happening 500 BC. And so I think what's interesting then for me is how we also have these narratives about what democracy is and isn't. When the historical record is quite clear that it was not that. It has not evolved. The word it's changed since then. I don't think it's changed since then. It's just another word was taken from a very different culture, and it was used then for a very different meaning. So anyway, I thought that was, for me, I was reflecting on that, and I thought others might watch.
And I'm thinking, just to round it out, Teresa, would you like to put your question?
So, I mean, I'm not sure to what extent there are questions for any particular speaker, but rather just some points of perhaps reflection that we can take from this conversation. So somebody mentioned, I think it was Dawson, that mentioned the notion of democratic failures, that indeed we see a lot of democratic failures. And I wonder if, in fact, this is important for us to pay attention to and ultimately ask the question of what is the role of failures in democracy in the process of democratization? And if that not plays an important role at the global level in the same way that perhaps it played a role at the national level. So I think a lot of times where individual democracies find themselves today has a lot to do with failures that have transpired historically, right? And that's in part why we see an evolution of what we accept as legitimate understandings of democracy. The other thing I want to mention is this question of, to some extent, I mean, some of us may be of the view that democracy can only mean one thing, and it's not an essentially contested concept, but I think it's still by many people seen as an essentially contested concept. And I wonder if in a world of multipolarity, that becomes even more relevant. And if in fact that means we have to accept it as a contested concept, or is there a baseline understanding of what it means in order to be accepted in a multipolar moment?
That is a great last question. And so what I'm going to do now is turn back to the panelists. We're going to go in reverse order, which means we're going to start with you, Tim. And you each get a robust 1 minute. So you have to, you need to pick one issue that you want to address, and then we will wrap it up and go to coffee break. So Tim, the floor is yours.
Okay, I'll try. I'll try to squeeze in two. I think Carmen's point, question, very important. Democracy is always a promise deferred to a large extent. So we are always in the process of putting in place successive approximations to democracy. So very difficult to say what success would look like, but definitely if we draw from the domestic analogy from the South African case, definitely dialogue, deliberation, contestation, leading to a global constitution-making process. So these are all very important stepping points to get to that. If we manage to have the initial conversation with Article 109 invoked in the General Assembly, I think that would be, for me, the beginning of a process that can get us forward. And then very quickly to Barry's point, between collaboration and competition, competition is already happening. The Chinese are already building their ecosystem to contest what Washington has put in place. But this leads us to the same path of authoritarianism, global authoritarianism, what Naomi Klein describes as global authoritarianism. So we need the parallel track of collaborative processes. And it might be the case, we're not going to have everybody inside the tent singing the same song. We will have multiple processes happening. So I see the collaborators gathering on the side, and it would be amazing to have the EU within that group. But as Davison has said, I don't think there is an awareness within the policymakers that this is the time to push for something new. We see Keir Starmer running off to Washington, genuflecting, and Trump going to the Middle East and coming home with trillions. There are certain groups that do not actually see this as a moment to move forward. They just simply want to bend the knee to the naked emperor with 34 felonies and then take us back to the 1930s.
Zoe.
So I would like to agree and disagree with Hassan. So elections are not the most characteristic element of ancient Athenian democracy. Actually, that was the most aristocratic element of it that survived, and it was very selectively, we picked and chose what we take from that. And we have the professionalization of politics later on. Yes, we have lawyers to represent us at court. We also have politicians that we delegate, our power to rule. But that has brought also problems with it, and increasing distrust in politics because we don't do it ourselves. Maybe we have to reconsider our political participation and how we involve people more, because I repeat, when we talk about democratizing, it's about empowering. And I have been reading a lot about the pedagogy of the oppressed, Paulo Freire, Brazilian author, which was about empowering through education. So you had to, abolish that hierarchy that I am the teacher, I know everything, you sit there and you're a passive learner. No, I'm learning from you too. So this is this, different relationship. So for me, this democracy should remain important because it's about, including more and more and giving them voice and power to decide about their fate.
Very good. Katerina.
So I will respond to the first and Andreas's question and then Teresa's comment. As I said in my presentation, I think there is a core or an essence of democracy. This is not a forever expandable, contestable concept. The core issue here is between the will of the majority and fundamental freedoms for individuals and minorities. And I think this has always been the contradiction that at times goes wrong in history. We've seen it time and time again. So when it comes to understanding specific situations, of course, we can see sort of variations of the same model. But I think the issue of the two sides of democracy, as I called it, and what happens when they clash, when they're not coming together, essentially in an integrated way, is what can blow this whole thing apart. Fortunately or unfortunately, we cannot have democracy without representation of the will of the majority. That would be the problem. And we have to find ways of doing that while also respecting the minority.
Thank you, Peter. So I'll very quickly address Hans' comments and Theresa's comments. So my first point is, ideas do not float freely. There must be carriers of ideas. When I say that liberal democracy is the byproduct of this post-war era, it has to do with the fact that there were countries exporting values, proposing institutions based on this liberalism that is attached to democracy throughout the world. The moment this order based on liberalism, based on liberal democracy, electoral democracy, when it starts to fade away, we should expect that a new concept, a new idea, a new design for democracy would come about. And disagreeing just a little bit with my friend Tim, I'm not 100% convinced that democracy is like a human institution, like it belongs to the human nature, because from a historical, longue durée perspective, it's rather an exception than a rule, right? Geographically speaking, demographically speaking, democracy is an exceptional condition, and I'm afraid we should be very attentive to it, because I'm not 100% confident that we are understanding the moment we are undergoing. We, the human, the humankind, I believe we are still very much attached to the old world, and this is what first coming to terms with the fact of multipolarization matters. Because if I'm right in my assumption, then I mean the change at the foundational level, the material capabilities, should precipitate something new at the ideational level. So this is what I'm, in a few words, trying to claim.
I think that's a great place to leave it, kind of friendly contestation. Please join me in thanking the panelists for, I think, a terrific opening session, good kickoff. You got a lot of issues on the table. You should be pretty busy for the next day and a half.